The DAR is playing its part in continuing the tradition of quilting in America. Each summer, the museum brings 25 children together to learn the history and techniques of quilting.
I have my quilt from the past 2 years hung up over my fireplace on the mantle, and I'm going to hang this one beside them. The best part of making a quilt, I think, though, is like looking at your finished product and like when it's all done, like seeing like you made this and it's like really nice and stuff. Each quilt has a story. Like the quilt that we got this pattern from was made in 1850 and had been passed down generation to generation, and I thought that was really neat, and I liked that a lot.
Besides learning just about the techniques of applique or piecing, we're passing on a little bit of the excitement about looking at these old quilts.
This is one of the largest quilts in the collection, made in 1842 by 18-year-old Emma Fish for her aunt Eliza Moore. It's an album quilt, which was typical of the time, made up of 72 small squares and a large one. Each square is signed by family and friends from Trenton, New Jersey. Album quilts were popular in the 1840s and 50s. They were tactile versions of the popular autograph albums of the time.
When this quilt was given to the DAR during World War II, it came to us in pieces, and we had to sew it back together. It's signed and dated Mary Manicky, Remember Me, 1851 and 1852. Well, after doing research, we found that she was from Rockville, Maryland. There's actually a Manicky Street in Rockville. She ended up getting married, not to William Thomas Johnson, whose name is also on the quilt, but she lived her entire life there, and in 1916 she died, and her estate ended up in a junk store on D Street in Washington. And we know this because the woman who donated it left a note telling how she found this quilt in 1916 in a junk store, how she took it home and took it apart and used the 4 outer panels as window curtains in her dining room and the center section as a wall decoration.
This charming album quilt was made by Ruth Penn for her son Thomas on the occasion of his marriage in 1853. His name is quilted into the central section of the quilt, and the names inscribed and stenciled in ink are relatives and friends of the bride and groom. This quilt was made in 1860 in Omaha, Nebraska by a transplanted New Yorker, Sarah Hall Guire. In 1860, Nebraska was still a frontier. Quilts made there during this decade were few and far between, as life was hard and access to expensive calicos was rare. She married in New York, moved to North Carolina, where she likely acquired the roller-printed cottons used in this quilt, and then moved to the new frontier in Nebraska, where she created the quilt.
This is a quilt made for a wedding. It was made by the sisters of Elizabeth Poindexter and her mom. Elizabeth's husband was a doctor during the Civil War and was killed. So after the war, Elizabeth decided to give this quilt to her sister when she was married in the 1870s. It was handed down in the family to each successive generation of firstborn daughters on the occasion of their wedding.
At the age of 81, Margaret English Wood Dodge made this pieced and appliqued counterpane as a commemorative bed cover for the Brooklyn Sanitary Fair of 1864. Her son, John Wood Dodge, a well-known painter of miniature portraits, painted the eagle in the center.
Lucy Howland Bassett Thatcher made this in the 1870s in Massachusetts, and it was given to us by her granddaughter several years later, and the family called the pattern Full-Blown Poppy. And the DAR Museum isn't so concerned with the names of quilt patterns since they changed as people moved around, but we are very interested in what the family or the quilt maker called the pattern of her quilt. Note the folded tape edging on the quilt. There were directions for this given in Peterson's magazine in 1871.
This quilt was made by sisters Anna and Elvira Hall of Quaker City, Ohio, who were the surviving grandchildren of the founder of Quaker City. The sisters never married and spent their life living together in the family home. Their quilts are typical of the types of the latter half of the 19th century: log cabin designs, silk and cotton piece quilts, and blue and white piece bed covers. One of the most primitive folk quilts in the collection was made in Arkansas in the 1870s. It's faded to a nice pink and green and is highly stuffed and very fragile. It was made by Louisa Harrison Greeson. Like many Arkansans, she was born in Tennessee and moved to Arkansas at the time of her marriage to a wagon maker and hotel keeper.
In the late 19th century, not all quilts were made to be bed covers. This quilt in particular was made as a cover for a table or to put over the back of the piano or the sofa. It was made in the 1880s. It's all silk. Its binding is a beautiful silk braid with 4 tassels on the edges, perfect for a Victorian table. American Quilts. The Daughters of the American Revolution has been collecting these beautiful bed covers since the Society was founded in 1890. They fulfill the Society's goals of documenting the achievements of American women, and they tell the story of America.